Right on.
Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly 30-minute radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. I'll be speaking with Kelly O'Donnell, a New Mexico economist, who was once on staff for New Mexico Voices for Children, one of our strongest allies. And just recently, she chimed in on a New Mexico political report on the need to diversify our economy. Her ideas on that mirror much of what Retake has advocated for years. So I asked Kelly to come on the show, and she's here today. We'll get to Kelly in just a minute, but first, a couple of announcements. Last week, I interviewed Vaughn Woodruff and Bill Dunn, two of the leading advocates and lobbyists for the newly proposed public power legislation in Maine. And they have testified extensively about the failures of Central Maine Power, Avangrid, and Iberdrola to serve the public interest in Maine. They have also been deeply involved in state opposition to Avangrid's efforts to construct unnecessary transmission lines through the pristine Maine forest and an array of other violations and underperformances by Avangrid. Next Thursday, July 8th, we are moderating a panel discussion with Woodruff, Dunn, and New Mexico utility advocate and expert, Marielle Nanasi. She's the executive director of New Energy Economy. If you want to chime in on that and check it out, go to retakeourdemocracy.org, click on the actions and events menu, and the first thing you'll see is the info about this important discussion. The PRC will be holding hearings on this merger in August. And if you haven't been tracking Retake's blogs on Avangrid and Iberdrola, this was a very interesting conversation that we had with Vaughn last week, Vaughn and Bill last week. The week prior to that, we spoke with Allegra Love, a longtime New Mexico immigration and refugee advocate, the founder of the Santa Fe Dreamers Project, and a friend. Allegra's interview was powerful, putting the border crisis in a very human perspective. Allegra does not mince words. So if you missed it, you can listen to either of those earlier shows or any of our shows. You can watch them all by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the Actions and Events menu, and clicking on Retake Conversations. And before we get started with Kelly, as is our practice, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this radio show on stolen Tewa land, and to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of that land. And we could learn a good deal from their stewardship. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Kelly. And she's having a little bit of instability in her connection, so she's shut off the audio of the video, and that won't matter for the radio show, but it will matter a little bit for the podcast. So let's get started. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about you tell us just a little bit about your background and maybe why the New Mexico Political Report thought it would be a good idea to call you to offer your thoughts on diversifying New Mexico's state economy.
Okay, sure. Well, let's see. I'm an economist. Got my doctorate from UNM a couple decades ago. I've worked pretty extensively in government, especially in tax policy, also around economic development, and at regulation and licensing. Right now, I am a research professor in the School of Public Administration at UNM. Spent a lot of time thinking about how to improve the well-being of New Mexico's more vulnerable populations through public policy, specifically tax policy. So I think those are my qualifications.
Okay, well, the New Mexico Political Reporter certainly found your comments germane, as it is a good part of the article that they did. And they always do such a good job of covering politics in New Mexico. So you were cited throughout the report, and with your focus being on tax policy and state investments in the kinds of things that might attract business from other states and incent existing business to stay in New Mexico and grow. Before we dive into that, how about you lay out for us just how the New Mexico state tax system has become so regressive and frankly underperforming?
Well, New Mexico is recently, as 30 or 40 years ago, had a pretty progressive and pretty solid tax system. There have been a series of changes in, really over the last 30 years that have incrementally damaged the system to the point where it is no longer able to support the appropriate level of state spending. I would you can trace the devolution of New Mexico's tax system to initially to the changes in the property tax, which reduced the role of property tax in funding state services. And then in the Richardson administration, there were some really radical personal income tax cuts, which undermined that component of the revenue system. Also, around that time, we saw gutting of the gross receipts tax base. I'll step back for a second and say that in a state tax system generally is made up of a property tax, income tax, and sales tax. Those are the three broad areas, and ideally those are somewhat balanced. In New Mexico, we really don't have a state level property tax at all. Our personal income tax has been improved in the last couple of sessions, but was really damaged by the cuts during the Richardson administration. The gross receipts tax base has been just steadily chipped away at for many, many years, with some massive holes placed in it in the last 20 years, such that the rate has had to go up a great deal in order to continue to support state services. So it's almost it's a series of incremental changes to the tax system that maybe didn't seem that major at the time, but have accumulated to the point where the tax system is really not very functional anymore.
Okay. So this was a bipartisan effort, although some might balk at considering Bill Richardson a Democrat. But overall, the time you've covered these issues, there was hardly a strong progressive Democratic presence in the legislature or on the fourth floor. But at least on the face of it, that is not the case now. Voices for Children, the Center on Law and Poverty, Retake Our Democracy, and lots of other grassroots groups have advocated for systemic reform of our tax and revenue policies with marginal success at best. But before we talk about the specific opportunities to fix the system, how is it that we have gotten so little done with democratically controlled legislature and government?
Well, I think that one.
Uh-oh. Kelly, if you can hear me, you're frozen.
The oil and gas industry as a source of state revenue. That has certainly been a major issue. And it has created, I think, a certain degree of inertia, in the sense that if you have a lot of revenue coming in, it's very hard to make the case that you have a structural deficit. So I think that's a major issue. I think there's also a reluctance to be perceived as a tax increaser in a state that struggles economically. And I think that as policymakers have searched around for ways to improve New Mexico's economy, the most obvious and sometimes the easiest appearing solution is tax incentives, but those cost money. So I think there's a variety of reasons that we haven't made more progress around tax policy. Although I would note that the last few years we have really started to fix some of the larger issues. So we need to acknowledge that there has been some recent progress made.
All right. Well, what do you think? You just mentioned, this is sort of a follow-up to that. You had mentioned that people don't want to be known as a tax person or a tax increaser in a state that's so poor. But couldn't that be reframed as a revenue generator, so that we can address some of the issues faced by those living in poverty?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of ways to frame things. I think that how things are interpreted in a political context is more than framing. But certainly there are many benefits associated with increasing revenue. And there is, I think, the political will now to do just that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start to talk just a bit about some of the kinds of tax reforms that could have an impact. One that you mentioned in the New Mexico political report was to increase property taxes and to tax second homes. And while you didn't state it explicitly, I presume you also mean to tax those second homes at a somewhat higher rate. Can you tell us what might be possible and how much revenue this could generate?
Well, property tax is hard to play with without amending the New Mexico Constitution. So we need to put that up front. Any really significant change to the property tax would require constitutional change. Right now, there are a number of mechanisms built into New Mexico's property tax system meant to protect people or New Mexico residents from large increases in property tax as a function of large increases in property value. And so that has protected some middle and moderate income people from untenable increases in property tax, but it has also protected a lot of very high income people, including second homeowners, from meaningful property tax. So in order to change that system, we would really need to look at our value, how we value property, and perhaps put into place a different mechanism for valuing second homes and property that aren't primary residences.
What might that look like?
Well, essentially right now, the increase in assessed value is capped in this state. So it can't increase by more than 3%. If you were to take that cap off of residential property that was used for commercial purposes, say an Airbnb or a second home, you could generate some revenue. And it's, obviously it's going to depend on the rate, and it's going to be a function of local rates to a large extent.
Mm-hmm.
But you could generate some revenue and in a way that would not be damaging to people who cannot afford it.
Yeah, and the property rates in at least in Santa Fe have been going through the roof. I don't know about down in Albuquerque, but and we've got a huge number of second homes here, so it very well could generate some significant revenue. But what is the political? Obviously it's the realtors who will scream that the sky is falling if you do anything to increase those property taxes. No,
I can't speculate as to who would be the largest opponent, but I can say that our reluctance as a state to tax property is, we come by it honestly, in the sense that property taxes historically have been used as a way to disenfranchise people, particularly before statehood. So I think there are some historical precedent for our aversion to property taxes, and I think what we need to do and to reinvigorate the property taxes to start some counter narratives. People are distrustful of property tax for historical reasons that perhaps don't exist now to the extent that they did even 50 years ago. And so I think there's some re-education involved in the process of making the property tax a more viable revenue source for the state.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that I had a conversation just before getting on with you with some folks who are working in the energy and utility industry. And they broached the same kind of thing, that in many ways we're stuck in a 1890s kind of mentality and framework for our utility industry and the way we generate and distribute energy. And their perspective was that in many ways we're kind of provincial and so afraid of making change that I think you're right. The education effort is what is needed so that people can understand things somewhat differently. So for as many sessions as I've attended, there has been talk about reforming the GRT, but so far it has been just talk. How could that be reformed to become less regressive and more productive and less complicated?
Well, I am a fan of a whole systems tax policy approach, such that the GRT, as it's essentially a sales tax, is going to be regressive. And would be very difficult to have a GRT that wasn't to some degree regressive and generated enough revenue to support state services. So I don't know that it's necessary to make the GRT less regressive. I think perhaps the solution is actually to make the income tax system more progressive, because a tax system is made up of many parts, and you can have a progressive personal income tax that offsets a regressive gross receipts tax and enables the state to generate enough money. So I think trying to make the gross receipts tax not regressive is probably impossible, and would cost a tremendous amount of money and not be the most efficient way to achieve an adequate and equitable tax system. I personally think that we should start putting the gross receipts tax back on a lot of the things we took it off of. And some of those were economic and development incentives, and some of them were things like groceries. There was a time when the gross receipts tax generated enough revenue or adequate revenue, and at a relatively low rate. A basic principle of good tax policy is broad base, low rate. That creates the least distortions within the economy. So I would like to see a lot of the things that have been removed from the base put back into the base, and the rate reduced. I think that produces the best outcome both for households and for businesses.
You had mentioned that the progressivity of the PIT, the personal income tax, could offset that. That doesn't necessarily help those people, low-income people who are paying the higher gross receipts tax, particularly when you're looking at food and groceries. But one of the things that Voices was advocating for to legitimately offset that increase, any increase or the existing cost to low-income families, was to offer increased tax credits that would then defray the cost of or the impact of the increased payments for GRTs. What is that? How does that sound to you?
Well, that is progressive personal income tax. That's the essence of a progressive personal income tax.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so we were saying the same thing in different words. New Mexico has a long history of having refundable tax credits within the personal income tax system, and going back to the early 70s, I believe, and those were put into place initially for the express reason of offsetting the regressivity in the gross receipts tax. It was already understood that was going to place the gross receipts tax placed a disproportionate burden on low-income households, and we needed to remedy that. So we have that mentality and that structure in place. What we need to do is really augment it in such a way, and we are moving in that direction, I will add, augment it in such a way that it really does effectively offset regressivity in the gross receipts tax. And I'm going to push back on the food thing again, because as a person who spends way too much money at Whole Foods, I personally feel I should be paying tax on those purchases. And I, there are a lot of people, I think, similarly situated. There's no reason that I should not be paying gross receipts tax on my purchase of groceries. And I'm, happy to pay a higher personal income tax rate in order to offset the burden that tax would place on people who are less able to afford it.
Okay. Well, we need to take a brief break here so that I can identify KSFR as the station you're listening to. It is Northern New Mexico's media gem, offering tremendous interviews on culture, politics, and the environment and on policy. They also provide a wide array of music to soothe your COVID nerves. While there are no commercials on KSFR, they do have bills to pay. And so we ask that you consider a contribution to KSFR. You can do that by going to ksfr.org and clicking on the red donate button. You can view this as something like your ticket for admission to some great programming. So when you finish listening to this show, why don't you go ahead and make that contribution? And I thank you very much for that. And I thank KSFR for this platform for Retake Our Democracy. Getting back to Kelly, you also described in the New Mexico Political Report how New Mexico has a tendency historically to try to lure mega corporations to New Mexico by offering tax breaks and other incentives. You suggested a different approach to attracting those new businesses from out of state. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Uh-oh.
I think that longtime practice of economic developers has been to try and lure businesses. Oh, I feel like maybe I've lost my connection.
No, you're there. All good.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry. I'm trying not to get distracted then. So New Mexico has historically, like most other states, put into place incentives intended to lure businesses to the state and get them hopefully to stay. My contention is that those incentives work at the margins. When a business is choosing between one or a handful of states, the one with a better incentive package may be the winner. However, that handful of states is going to be chosen on the basis of factors other than tax policy. And a major issue that businesses and individuals consider when they are choosing where to locate or live is the education system. And our education system is broken. And until we until we accumulate the political will to really improve our education system, we are not going to be in the running for economic development projects. And so we are not going to be in that handful of businesses or in that handful of states that a business is considering moving to. We aren't going to move to the top of the pile without better education and better healthcare too. And those are investments that we need to make now with the expectation that they will benefit our economy in the long run.
Okay.
But we need to do that. Yeah, it's an upfront investment that needs to be made with the expectation that's going to take a little while.
And that
I don't
takes
think
tax policy reform, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So, well, I don't think you commented on this. One thing that Retake and others have stressed as a means of diversifying the economy is to invest more in small business. Is that something for which you'd advocate?
Well, sure. I think that supporting small business, particularly the growth and expansion of New Mexico entrepreneurs, is really important. I mean, there's no question about that. I think that we have the potential here in New Mexico to really capitalize upon the research coming out of our national laboratories and build upon small businesses that are leveraging those technologies. And there are lots of different areas in which small businesses are growing and flourishing in this state. So indeed, it is important to support small businesses. Now, again, how you go about doing that is another question that requires thought.
Okay. So earlier we discussed the barriers to passing legislation to reform our tax system. We didn't really touch on the institutional resistance to increasing taxes within the Legislative Finance Council and legislative services. Can you discuss how this might inhibit more progressive tax policy? I mean, these are the folks that draft the financial impact reports. And, my experience with that is they put a pretty conservative lens on anything that involves spending or revenue generation through taxes. What can advocates do to overcome this?
Well, you're talking to an economist, and so I tend to put a pretty conservative spin on things too. So I tend to find the analysis that comes out of the state. I mean, obviously, it's difficult to produce a lot of analysis in a really short period of time, which is what happens during the session. But I actually find the level of analysis of these proposals to be pretty solid, and I have a great deal of faith in the folks who work for the Legislative Finance Committee. So I can't really argue with the approach that they have taken. I think it's responsible and appropriate. Obviously, there are different lenses through which to look at policies, and I would argue probably that really the onus is on the advocates to a large degree to make a case to better explain the case and perhaps to do a somewhat better job of explaining the economic benefits of some of the proposals that, that are supported. The job of the Legislative Finance Committee and staff really is to try and produce unbiased analysis of proposals, and that's a challenge. And so I don't think the solution is there, frankly. I think they're doing a pretty good job. I think the solution actually exists within the business community to some degree, to understand perhaps a little bit more, or to be a little bit more open-minded about ways to foster a strong economy. But I think that's a communications issue as opposed to an analysis issue.
Well, we talked a little bit earlier about, how the realtors could oppose property tax increases or tax increases on second homes and things like that. The same thing tends to happen whenever you're asking for taxes, especially business taxes, from the business community, especially from the chambers of commerce, et cetera. Do you think there are ways to educate them that a small increase in certain kinds of business taxes might actually stabilize the local and state economy and benefit those same businesses?
Well, I think that the economic case for spending or specific programs can be made. I think that perhaps we're just not making it in a compelling enough fashion. I certainly think that the chambers of commerce are writ large, are as interested as anybody else in a diversified economy and adequate revenue. The dichotomy between the interests of business and the interests of households has always struck me as a little bit false. And perhaps the answer to your question lies in sort of dismantling that dichotomy, that we're really all in this together, and that the solutions that are best for kids and families are also ultimately the solutions that are best for businesses in this state.
All right, well, we got one more question in about a minute and a half, so I'm going to try and abbreviate the question. In the political report, you mentioned that a transition, the pause from fracking really wasn't going to have bad economic impact on the state or the industry. And yet you articulated that, a transition to a more sustainable economy, it could form a kind of, you use the term glide path to a sustainable economy. Could you articulate on that?
Sure. Well, to clarify, the moratorium that I was referring to is the federal moratorium on leases. It's not a moratorium on fracking because wells are still being permitted. So that leases that exist are BLM is issuing permits and oil and gas are being extracted. So there's no moratorium on the activity of extracting oil and gas in New Mexico. There's a moratorium on the activity of leasing new properties for that purpose. Fortunately, fortunately for the oil companies, they have a massive backlog of leases, so that there is a real inventory of land that they have to explore and develop before running into anything that would lower production. And in fact, production is likely to go up because it tracks with the price of oil, which is going up. So that's why the moratorium on leases is very unlikely to have any impact on state revenue, because extraction is continuing and the pace of permitting has actually increased substantially. So there's no reason to believe that there would be a negative impact on state revenue from that.
Well, Kelly, we're completely out of time, so unfortunately, we're not going to get to hear about your glide path, but maybe we can stick around for a minute after the radio show ends and complete that. So I want to thank Kelly for joining us today and let you know that next week I'll have Tina Cordova from the Downwinders Consortium, and she'll be talking about the Tularosa and the atomic blast down there and their impact. Thank you very much for joining us today, and stay safe, stay healthy, and most of all, stay active. We'll be back next week. And by the miracle of podcasts, Kelly's here.
I'm
Yay.
back.
And so Kelly, you were talking about a glide path to a sustainable economy. You want to articulate more on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the moratorium on new leases of federal land for oil and gas sends the right message that we are in the process as a nation, but as a frankly as a Earth of divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in renewable energy, and that is going to be an incremental and fairly slow process, but it is incumbent upon us here in New Mexico to try to minimize the damage that weaning off of oil and gas has on those communities in the Southeast and Northwest that have traditionally been really, really reliant on oil and gas. And frankly, Santa Fe is really, really reliant on revenue from oil and gas as well. So we need to gradually wean ourselves, and one component of that weaning is this moratorium, which, like I said, isn't going to really impact production at this point, but it does.
You may have to get rid of your picture.
Oil and,
You might have to get rid of your picture because you froze there for a second.
Sorry. Okay, I'm going away again. So the other component of weaning ourselves from oil and gas, at least from a revenue perspective, is starting to look at oil and gas revenue as non-recurring. In state budgeting, you have recurring revenue that you use to spend on programs, ongoing programs, and you have non-recurring revenue that you use for one-time expenditures. I think starting to reclassify some of the revenue we get from oil and gas as non-recurring is another really important component of that process of gradually weaning ourselves from oil and gas revenue.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that suggestion, and I like the idea a lot. One of the things that we were talking about, that I was talking about before I got on with you, was the potential for New Mexico generating and transmitting its own solar and wind energy as a means of diversifying our economy. Does that seem like a viable option to you?
Yeah, I do. And I think that it seemed like a viable option for a lot of years. Certainly that was a big initiative in the Richardson administration, and Governor Lujan Grisham has reinvigorated those efforts. It's obviously that's a place where we have, New Mexico as a state has a comparative advantage. We have good solar values and good wind values, and we have a renewable energy transmission authority that can help us take the energy that we produce from those resources and export them.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me, Kelly. I look forward to this. Was a good conversation. I'm going to end the radio show and podcast now, but I'd like you to stick around for just 1 second so that we can talk about something. All right. Thank you, listeners. We'll be back next week.